Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Now, I recently saw a video from Mad Skills talking about the healer role changing, and there are a few points I disagreed on and really wanted to make my own video on it. So I want to talk today about how healer damage matters and how it's grossly overrated in a lot of situations for a lot of players. So what do I mean by that? Well, first and foremost, the conversation that he had was talking about how reworking Holy Priest in 10.2.6, which shuffled around a lot of talents and also streamlined some, was part of like a trend that Blizzard had recognized that healer damage was this big important thing and that everybody needed to have this sort of synergy around it. To that I say, it's kind of been that way for a while. Holy Priest's rework is really just streamlining the damage effects of Imperial Blaze, which used to be an active ability, and then kind of rolling it into Chastise so Holy Priest could do the damage a little more easier without one global which does like nothing in Imperial Blaze the way it used to be to get those free Holy Fires. So I really think a lot of the healer damage craze for the entire community, not just the sweaty 1% nerds, was really Shadowlands, where healer checks were really low. And when these fights had maybe one boss in the dungeon which might be considered a heal check, or you just would need a healer for it, many times the healers were just brought for their active damage like Vesper Totem Shaman, or their passive damage with PI and the Night Fae Fairies for priests. And so whichever healer was in bringing the best damage really was the one getting brought to the table, and it was all about just killing off the mobs as quickly as you can. Now M Plus has two modifiers on it for infinitely scaling goodness. You have increased mob HP and you have increased mob damage, which is changed and adjusted by the M0 scaling. So that base is then increased by 10% per key level over and over and over again. And so in Shadowlands, it was really a big emphasis on mob health, and in Dragonflight, it's actually a really big emphasis on mob damage. Now, if you played in Season 3, this was a season like most others, except the mob health felt enormously low, and that teams were very quickly doing 20s, even though they racked up 20, 30 something deaths along the way. They were still chesting these dungeons as a result of the mobs dying very easily and the timers being a bit more forgiving. And this change to the scaling of dungeons is where healer damage becomes more or less important in terms of what you're doing. And as a result, I think for the past couple seasons now that we've had in Dragonflight, it has been either a situation where you are having people avoiding bringing a healer entirely so you could bring a damage dealer, as we saw in Season 1 and quite a lot in Season 3, or you're in these situations where there's like these forced healer checks and there's a lot of moments where the healer is not able to contribute as much damage, or more importantly, they're not changing around their build, their talents, their trinkets, things like that to meaningfully diminish their healing by adding more damage. So what does this mean for the average player? Well, it's that the success rate of dungeons and actually making it so whether or not you chest a dungeon or not is not determined on whether the healer is just blasting damage constantly. Obviously, having a thumb up your rear end and doing nothing doesn't feel like you're doing much to be able to help the group. But what I mean is actually changing around your build and focusing your build around only doing damage. Those things feel incredibly overrated in the content as it stands right now. I do think, of course, that there's some more what I would call like micro elements where healer damage does matter a lot. The macro of it is sort of your build and what you bring into the dungeon without changing spec. I'm not going to talk about the whole like healers leaving the dungeon to go DPS spec, because that is cringe 0.1% stuff that doesn't matter to you guys at all. No, what I mean is actually putting together that build and going into the dungeon knowing you're going to be doing less healing as a result. I think it's a really good thing when dungeons have challenging healer checks, because it avoids that situation where you could even think to afford to have like pure raw damage trinkets all the time to be able to adjust around it. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule, but as long as it's maybe a dungeon here or there each season, maybe it's an Atal Dazar once a season, I think that's actually okay. So from a dungeon perspective, I do think we have a few dungeons in general where you can kind of get away with dealing more damage than others. I think things like Brackenhide Hollow, where bringing a damage trinket to the table so you can kill totems faster, is a really nice exception to the rule, because you're doing damage to actively reduce damage taken by your party. I love those kind of mechanics, even though I hate that kind of boss fight because it just takes forever on Tyrannical. But there's also a few other encounters which are more about survivability. rather than a raw HPS check. Now, I know we're going to talk about Khajiit in a second, but I think some dungeons like Algathar are really good ways of encapsulating how important it is just to survive burst. And that's where defensive, absorb, safe trinkets, you might say, like Rage Heart and Ward, I think are so successful in this kind of season because you're taking the extra mile to be able to absorb other damage that other people have had. It's very reminiscent of Legion M+ with Ishkar's Fell Shield Emitter, which was a great absorb trinket we had back then. And that gameplay is really fun, especially when you're playing with a coordinated squad, because you can start cycling through these defensives and kind of playing around what the boss is going to be throwing at you. But you also have things like Halls of Infusion, which are raw HPS checks, where every little bit of your talent build needs to be engineered towards healing the hardest boss and making sure you get over it successfully. That is very reminiscent of like Temple of Sathralis, where you would have boss after boss after boss just having crazy healing checks. We don't necessarily need to go back to that, but the idea that there's going to be dungeons which are just really tough healer checks and might have success or failure depending on your ability as a healer, those things are very good. If you want to have a good balanced environment where everybody's decisions and everybody's impact matters, well, you need to have some damage checks, you need to have some heal checks, and so forth. It also prevents the game from getting to a point where people are sort of engineered just for one thing and one thing alone. One of the best things really about WoW is the adaptability to different dungeons, damage profiles, healing profiles, the works. And it's one thing I felt like I really missed when I played Final Fantasy, because I went through 2 different Savage Raid tiers, and it felt like I was really punished as a healer in that game as I played Astrologian to think about GCD healing. And we would have so many moments where we were just really close to hitting enraged checks or damage checks in that game. And then I felt bad for healing my allies, and like it was the wrong decision even though they had taken some extra damage, or my co-healer and I were not as efficient together as we could have been by using our off GCD abilities. And that is where I felt this sort of constant pressure to interact with a damage rotation, which I didn't think that was really that fun. In WoW, obviously, we have a little more going on with a healer damage rotation, but I wouldn't say it's too different. And I think that they've done a good job of making sure there's actually healing checks, although in fact, I kind of wish there was more to be able to prevent this sort of macro environment where you can just bring a healer for only a certain slice of the dungeon and then kind of switch it out at that elite level. So that's what I mean by the macro environment, is the overall dungeon and what you're going to be experiencing. But I also want to talk about some of the micro, what is actually happening from boss pull to boss pull, from trash pack to trash pack. You're always going to have those moments where you're fighting what is basically a trash can of a boss, like Razan, like Treemouth that you have in Brackenhide Hollow, that basically do nothing. Yes, of course, those are areas where your healer damage is very valuable to you. Pretty sure most could agree on that. But there's also some trash packs where it feels almost better to just add more damage as a healer than to really sort of like sit back and try to heal things. But it also sort of varies by the level of key that you're doing. One of the biggest examples I have is like Algathar Academy and the Veximus pull, where you're just grabbing all of these mobs together. This is something that is, of course, going to happen at higher key levels, and it's also just going to be a pull that's easily replicated by like the average tank. And so as a result, even if you're not a high key level person, you might just be forced into healing this because other tanks have seen that it can be done and seen that it can be successful. At a lower key level, because player's stamina is high enough to actually take a hit, in fact, it might even be high enough to take like 2 casts from some of those mobs, you often do want to sit back and just be ready to heal and blast healing. But when you get to a higher key level, this is actually an area where damage really matters for the healer, because you're not really going to be able to do much to heal through the ad cast going through. And so even making a pull go 5 seconds faster, 6 seconds faster, because you are tunneling some extra damage with the knowledge that once all of the AoE crowd controls run out, people could just get obliterated in a heartbeat. Yeah, that's an area where healers really should be focusing onto their damage. And it's a focus that is built from gameplay, not being built from your talent selection or your trinkets in advance. It is the micro, not the macro. Good example of this is if you're playing a Holy Priest and you have Divine Word. That's an excellent ability that can be used for damage or healing. And being able to pick and choose in those situations, whether you're on Treemouth and want it to go faster, whether you're on the massive Veximus pull and you think people are just gonna die if any casts go through, those are excellent areas to be able to have flexibility in a talent so that you are going to be ready for the worst case scenario of high healing required, or the best case scenario of minimal healing required. You can always find a solution that's going to work for you or your group when you're in that situation. The amount of overall damage that a healer contributes is always going to be an important topic as well. As I mentioned before, Final Fantasy really focuses on that healer damage, and healers make up a really large amount of the overall damage, so that you may or may not actually hit damage checks if your healers aren't adding damage. In a dungeon environment, obviously the damage checks always are going to be scaling higher. I've heard people in the past say they want healers to be a greater percentage of the damage that a group does, and I think that we kind of are at like a perfect spot. I think healers are around 10-ish% of the overall damage if they're actively contributing at these higher key levels that I've seen, and I think that's a pretty good spot to be at so that you can have some influence over the damage, but it doesn't feel so punishing to the entire dungeon run if you're not sitting there DPSing overall. Overall this season, I think that we are in a frustrating situation of having more examples of people running without healers on a lot of boss encounters and a lot of trash encounters, and a lot of those are boiling down to the ability of like Vengeance Demon Hunter and a coordinated, calmed up group to be able to shut down mobs from casting and using abilities for 30-40 seconds or more, which again kind of gets rid of our entire purpose as being healers, unless they actually start changing around some mobs that are dealing unavoidable amounts of damage. This is something like Halls of Atonement or something, where you always have to have the healing. Kind of concerned about that going into the next expansion, because a lot of old dungeons in particular have these kind of like trash can bosses that don't really do a whole lot, and I'm especially worried about them having to, design or work around making NPCs that are actually going to do unavoidable amounts of damage, because a lot of times they don't do that, or they do it where it's really annoying and it's like stacking bleeds and like unavoidable like nukes onto players. My hope for the War Within is a point where healer damage still has about 10% or so overall of the damage for the entire keystone, and that there's actually more mobs that are dealing unavoidable amounts of damage that cannot be just immune through or cooldowned or off healed through, so that healers are actually going to be required. I think to be able to increase the agency of this role and their ability to have a material impact on the dungeon, you do need to have more of these healing checks that are present, and honestly a lot of less defensive power for many of the specs of the game, because there's just a crazy amount of bloat for defensives, and we have a whole other video talking about that. I think healer damage has a lot of importance in the micro situations when you can weave in extra damage without risking the life of your teammates, but I think it's pretty overrated in the macro sense that in order to do a good job in dungeons, you need to bring these double damage trinkets, or you need to be able to do these things with your talents that could lower your healing ability but increase your damage tenfold. And as always, make sure you let me know what you think in the comments down below, and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching, hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.